Sarah Collins, a woman who once had everything, now lived in a mansion that felt unbearably empty. The laughter of children no longer echoed through its halls, and the vibrant energy that once filled the rooms had faded into silence. It had been nearly 2 years since her son, Daniel, disappeared without a trace, and since then, her life had been a relentless struggle to find meaning in a world that seemed to have lost all color. Despite her pain, Sarah never stopped giving. She had always been generous, using her wealth to support various charities and causes. But today was different. Today, she needed to do something more personal, something that might ease the ache in her heart, if only for a moment. That's why she found herself standing outside the gates of St. Mary's orphanage, a large box of toys in her hands. The orphanage was modest, a place where the walls were painted with bright colors, yet the atmosphere carried a quiet sadness. Sarah took a deep breath, summoning the strength she needed, and walked through the entrance. As she stepped inside, the children's voices filled the air, a mix of excitement and shyness as they noticed the elegant woman who had just entered. "Good morning, Mrs. Collins," greeted Mrs. Hayes, the kind but weary director of the orphanage. She was a woman in her 50s, with soft gray hair and eyes that spoke of too many years spent comforting lost souls. "The children have been eagerly awaiting your visit." Sarah managed a small smile, trying to hide the turmoil within her. "I've brought some toys," she said, her voice warm yet tinged with a sadness that Mrs. Hayes couldn't quite place. As the children gathered around, Sarah began handing out the toys, her heart both heavy and light at the same time. Each child's face lit up with joy, a sight that momentarily eased the weight she carried. She moved through the group, offering a doll here, a car there, her gaze drifting around the room until it landed on a boy sitting alone in the corner. He was small, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, with dark hair that fell over his eyes and a somber expression that didn't match the other children's excitement. He clutched a worn teddy bear tightly to his chest, his gaze fixed on the floor as if he were in a world all his own. Sarah felt a pang of empathy for the boy. He reminded her so much of Daniel at that age, quiet, introspective, always holding onto his favorite bear. Her footsteps slowed as she approached him, her heart pounding in her chest. She knelt down beside him, her voice soft and gentle. "Hello there," she said, trying to catch his attention. "What's your name?" The boy looked up at her, his eyes filled with a sadness far beyond his years. "Timmy," he whispered, his grip tightening on the bear. Sarah smiled, though her heart ached. "That's a lovely bear you have there, Timmy. Is he your best friend?" Timmy nodded, not saying a word, his gaze dropping back to the floor. "Would you like a new toy to play with?" she asked, holding out a small truck, hoping to see some spark of interest in his eyes. But Timmy just shook his head, holding the bear even closer, as if it were a lifeline in a sea of uncertainty. Sarah felt a lump in her throat as she watched him, her mind racing with memories of Daniel. The resemblance was uncanny, not in appearance, but in the way Timmy seemed to carry the weight of the world on his small shoulders. Unable to shake the growing sense of unease, Sarah stood up and walked back to Mrs. Hayes, who had been watching the interaction from a distance. "That boy, Timmy," Sarah began, her voice unsteady. "He seems different from the others." Mrs. Hayes sighed, her expression turning somber. "Timmy has had a rough start in life. He was found abandoned in a park about a year ago. No one knows where he came from, and he's been very withdrawn ever since. That bear is the only thing that seems to comfort him." Sarah felt her heart clench. The bear, did he have it with him when he was found? Mrs. Hayes nodded. "Yes, it was the only thing he had. We've tried to give him other toys, but he only ever wants that bear." Sarah's mind began to whirl with thoughts she couldn't quite grasp. There was something about that bear, something familiar that she couldn't place. But before she could dwell on it further, Mrs. Hayes touched her arm gently. "Would you like to meet the other children? They've been looking forward to your visit." Sarah forced herself to focus, nodding as she followed Mrs. Hayes back to the group. But as she mingled with the children, handing out the remaining toys, her thoughts kept drifting back to Timmy and that bear. And in the pit of her stomach, a sense of dread began to grow, though she didn't yet understand why. As Sarah moved through the orphanage, handing out the last of the toys, She couldn't shake the image of Timmy clutching that bear. It nagged at her, a persistent feeling that something was off, though she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Once all the children had received their toys, the room filled with laughter and chatter. The sight was heartwarming, but Sarah's thoughts kept drifting back to the little boy in the corner. She found herself glancing at him more often than she meant to, watching as he sat there, still withdrawn, seemingly untouched by the joy surrounding him. After some time, Mrs. Hayes approached her with a smile. "The children really appreciate your visit, Mrs. Collins. It's not every day they get new toys." Sarah returned the smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I'm glad I could bring them some happiness," she replied, her voice distant. Mrs. Hayes noticed the slight change in Sarah's demeanor and followed her gaze to where Timmy Saturday. "He's a special one, isn't he?" she remarked softly. Sarah nodded, her heart heavy with a mixture of emotions she couldn't fully understand. "Yes, he is." There was a pause before Sarah asked, "Do you mind if I sit with him for a little while?" "Not at all," Mrs. Hayes said, stepping aside to give her some space. Sarah slowly made her way back to Timmy. As she approached, she noticed how small he looked in the oversized chair, his feet barely touching the floor. He didn't look up when she sat beside him. His attention was entirely focused on the bear in his arms. "Timmy," Sarah began gently, "would you like to tell me about your bear?" Timmy didn't respond immediately. He stroked the bear's fur absently, as if lost in thought. Finally, he whispered, "His name is Mr. Snuggles." Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. Mr. Snuggles. The name echoed in her mind, a name she hadn't heard in nearly 2 years. She fought to keep her voice steady. "Mr. Snuggles, that's a nice name. Did you name him?" Timmy shook his head. "No, my mommy did." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken memories. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Daniel had called his bear Mr. Snuggles too. It had been his favorite toy, a constant companion since he was a toddler. But it couldn't be the same bear. It just couldn't. "Your mommy must have loved you very much," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. Timmy's eyes welled up with tears, and he buried his face in the bear's fur. "I miss her," he mumbled, his voice muffled. "She's gone now." Sarah's heart broke for him. She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his back. "I'm so sorry, Timmy. I know how hard that must be." He looked up at her then, his eyes filled with a depth of sadness that no child should have to carry. "Are you missing someone too?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. "Yes," she admitted, her voice thick with emotion. "I lost my son, Daniel, a little while ago." Timmy's gaze softened, as if he understood her pain. "Was he a good boy?" "The best," Sarah replied, her throat tightening. "He was kind and sweet, just like you." They sat there in silence for a moment, connected by their shared grief. Sarah couldn't help but feel a strange bond with this child, one that went beyond mere sympathy. It was as if they were tied together by something deeper, something she couldn't yet explain. She glanced at the bear again, a nagging thought clawing at the back of her mind. "Timmy," she asked carefully, "can I see Mr. Snuggles for a moment?" Timmy hesitated, his grip tightening on the bear. But something in Sarah's eyes must have reassured him, because he slowly handed it over. Sarah took the bear gently, her hands trembling. The fur was soft, worn from years of love and care. She turned it over, her breath catching as she saw the small patch on the bear's back where the fur had worn away completely. She knew that patch well. She had sewn it herself, trying to keep Daniel's beloved bear intact after it had been dragged through countless adventures. It was the same bear. Her mind raced, 1,000 thoughts crashing into each other. How did Timmy end up with Daniel's bear? What had happened in the year since Daniel disappeared? Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of hope, fear, and desperation swirling inside her. Without thinking, Sarah let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as the realization hit her with the force of a train. "Oh my God," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Timmy looked at her, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. "What's wrong, Mrs. Collins?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah stared at the bear, then at Timmy, struggling to find the words. She needed answers, but how could she ask without scaring him? How could she unravel this mystery without falling apart? Sarah stammered, her mind spinning. She was on the edge of something monumental, and she knew it. Timmy, do you remember where you got Mr. Snuggles? Timmy shook his head slowly. I've always had him. He's the only thing I remember having from before I came here. The room seemed to tilt, and Sarah had to steady herself against the armrest of the chair. This was more than a coincidence. This was a thread, a fragile, tenuous thread that might lead her back to Daniel. But the implications were terrifying. What if she was wrong? What if this was just another cruel twist of fate? She had to know the truth. She had to find out what had happened, no matter how painful it might be. But first, she needed to regain her composure, to think clearly. Taking a deep breath, she handed the bear back to Timmy, her fingers trembling as she released it. Thank you, Timmy, she said softly, trying to mask the turmoil in her heart. You take good care of Mr. Snuggles, okay? Timmy nodded, clutching the bear close once more. I will. Sarah forced a smile, though it felt like her heart was shattering into a million pieces. I'll be back soon, she promised, though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to, Timmy or herself. As she stood to leave, her mind raced with 1,000 questions. She had no idea where this path would lead her, but one thing was certain. She wasn't going to stop until she found the answers she needed. And as she walked out of the orphanage, the image of Timmy and that bear burned into her mind. She knew this was only the beginning. Sarah left St. Mary's Orphanage with her heart pounding and her mind reeling. The revelation about Timmy's bear had shaken her to her core, leaving her desperate for answers. As she drove away, her hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, knuckles white with tension. She replayed every moment in her mind, every detail of Timmy's sad eyes and his protective hold on Mr. Snuggles. It was too much to be a coincidence. There had to be a connection. Once she was home, Sarah found herself pacing the vast, empty rooms of her mansion, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. Daniel's absence had never felt more pronounced. Everywhere she looked, she saw reminders of him. The toys he used to play with, the art projects he'd proudly hung on the fridge, the bookshelves filled with his favorite stories. And now, Timmy had reawakened all that pain, bringing it back to the surface with a force she hadn't anticipated. Unable to sit still, Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed the number for her private investigator, Jack Donovan. She had hired Jack after Daniel's disappearance, desperate to find any lead that the police might have missed. Jack was good, relentless, even. But after months of searching, he had hit a dead end, and Sarah had been forced to accept that she might never know what happened to her son. But now there was a glimmer of hope. The phone rang twice before Jack's gruff voice answered. Sarah? It's been a while. Jack, I need your help, Sarah said, her voice strained. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. I was at an orphanage today, and I met a boy. He had Daniel's bear. I'm sure of it. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Daniel's bear? Are you certain? Yes, she insisted, the urgency in her voice unmistakable. It was Mr. Snuggles. The same worn patch on its back, everything. Jack, I don't know how he got it, but I need to find out. Jack didn't hesitate. Give me the details. I'll start looking into it right away. Sarah relayed everything she knew. Timmy's name, how he was found abandoned a year ago, the orphanage where he was staying. Jack listened intently, his mind already piecing together the fragments of information. I'll dig into it, Jack promised. But Sarah, you need to be prepared. This could lead nowhere, or it could open up old wounds. Are you sure you're ready for that? Sarah closed her eyes, trying to steady her racing heart. I don't have a choice, Jack. I need to know what happened. All right, Jack said, his voice firm. I'll be in touch as soon as I have something. After hanging up, Sarah felt a surge of determination. Jack would find answers, but she couldn't just sit around and wait. She needed to take action, to feel like she was doing something to get closer to the truth. She walked into Daniel's old room, the place she had avoided for so long because of the pain it held. The door creaked as she pushed it open, and a wave of memories hit her. Daniel's laughter, the way he would jump onto his bed, pretending it was a pirate ship or a rocket to the moon. The room was exactly as he had left it, frozen in time. Her eyes fell on the small dresser by the window, where Daniel had kept his most treasured possessions. She walked over and opened the top drawer, her hands trembling slightly. Inside were various knickknacks, a collection of seashells, a toy car, a small flashlight. And at the very back, tucked beneath a stack of drawings, was the tag that had once been attached to Mr. Snuggles. She held the tag in her hand, her heart aching as she read the faded letters. Daniel's best friend. It was a gift from her late husband, a way of marking the bear as special, something to be cherished. Daniel had adored that bear, and now it was with another child. A child who had been found abandoned, just like Daniel had been taken. It couldn't be a coincidence. Sarah knew she had to go back to the orphanage. There was something about Timmy that she couldn't let go of, a connection she needed to explore further. She grabbed her keys and headed for the door, her steps purposeful, her resolve unshakable. When she arrived at St. Mary's again, Mrs. Hayes was surprised to see her back so soon. "Mrs. Collins, is everything all right?" Sarah nodded, though she knew she was far from all right. "I was hoping to spend some more time with Timmy," she said, her voice calm despite the storm inside her. Mrs. Hayes looked at her curiously but didn't press for details. "Of course. I'll bring him to the common room." As Sarah waited, her thoughts swirled in a chaotic mix of fear and hope. She needed to approach this carefully to gain Timmy's trust without overwhelming him. When he finally appeared, holding Mr. Snuggles tightly to his chest, Sarah felt her heart lurch. "Hi, Timmy," she greeted him with a warm smile. "I'm back. I was wondering if you'd like to spend some time with me today?" Timmy looked up at her with those solemn eyes, and for a moment, Sarah feared he might refuse. But then he nodded, a small, hesitant nod, and Sarah felt a flicker of relief. They sat down together in the corner of the room, away from the noise and bustle of the other children. Sarah tried to keep the conversation light, asking him about the games he liked to play, the books he enjoyed. But all the while, her mind was racing, trying to find a way to bring up the bear without scaring him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she took a deep breath and said, "Timmy, do you know what happened before you came to the orphanage? Where you lived, or who took care of you?" Timmy's small body tensed, and he looked down at the bear, his fingers nervously playing with its ear. I don't remember much," he said softly. "Just bits and pieces." "What do you remember?" Sarah asked gently, leaning in a little closer. "Anything at all?" Timmy hesitated, then whispered, "I remember someone singing to me. A lady. She was nice, but I don't remember her face. And there was a big house, I think, with lots of rooms." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. A big house. It could be nothing, or it could be everything. "Do you remember anything else?" she pressed, her voice barely above a whisper. Timmy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't like thinking about it. It makes me sad." Sarah's heart ached for him. She didn't want to push him too far, too fast. "It's okay, Timmy," she said softly. "You don't have to talk about it if it hurts. I'm just here to listen, whenever you're ready." Timmy nodded, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. He looked so small, so vulnerable, and Sarah's protective instincts kicked in full force. She reached out and gently touched his arm. "You're safe here, Timmy. No one will hurt you." He looked up at her, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "Promise?" "I promise," Sarah said, her voice firm and filled with conviction. As they sat there in silence, the weight of the unspoken words hung heavy between them. Sarah knew this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey, but she also knew she couldn't walk away. Not now. Not when she was so close to finding out the truth. And as she watched Timmy clutch Mr. Snuggles, she couldn't help but wonder. Was it possible that this little boy held the key to finding her son? Or was she just chasing shadows, hoping against hope that the nightmare she had lived through could finally have a happy ending? Only time would tell, but Sarah was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The sun was setting as Sarah drove home, her mind racing with everything Timmy had told her. The pieces were starting to come together, but there were still too many gaps, too many unanswered questions. She knew she couldn't stop now. She had to keep digging, had to find out how Timmy had come to possess Daniel's bear. The connection between them was too strong to ignore. As soon as she stepped into her house, Sarah headed straight for her study. The room was a sanctuary of sorts, lined with shelves of books and mementos from a life that now felt distant. She sat down at her desk, turned on her computer, and pulled out the file she had kept on Daniel's disappearance. It was thick, filled with reports, timelines, and notes from countless interviews with the police, private investigators, and anyone else who might have had a clue. But now, for the first time in months, Sarah felt a renewed sense of purpose. She opened the file and began to review everything with fresh eyes, searching for anything she might have missed before. The police report, the descriptions of Daniel's last known whereabouts, the witness statements. She pored over every detail, her eyes scanning the documents with an intensity that bordered on desperation. She knew that somewhere in these pages there had to be a lead, a thread that would connect her son to Timmy. As she worked, the hours slipped by unnoticed. The house was silent, save for the faint hum of the computer and the soft rustle of paper as she flipped through the pages. Outside, the night deepened, the world settling into darkness, but Sarah was far from tired. Her mind was buzzing, driven by the need to uncover the truth. And then she found it, a small, seemingly insignificant note buried in the margins of one of the reports. It was from a police officer who had been part of the initial search for Daniel, a note that had been dismissed at the time as unrelated to the case. But now, in light of what Sarah knew, it stood out like a beacon. Unconfirmed sighting of a child matching Daniel's description near Elmwood Park, accompanied by an unknown woman. No further leads developed. Elmwood Park. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The park was only a few miles from St. Mary's Orphanage. She grabbed her phone and quickly dialed Jack Donovan's number, her fingers trembling as she waited for him to pick up. "Jack, it's Sarah. I think I found something," she said the moment he answered. "What is it?" Jack asked, his voice sharp and alert. There was a note in one of the reports about a sighting of Daniel near Elmwood Park. The woman he was with was never identified. "Jack, the park is close to the orphanage where Timmy was found." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line as Jack processed the information. "That's a solid lead," he finally said. "I'll look into it. I'll check the records, see if anyone matching that description was seen around the time Timmy was found." "Thank you," Sarah said, her voice filled with both gratitude and anxiety. "I need to know, Jack. I need to know what happened." "I'll do my best," Jack assured her. "I'll get back to you as soon as I have something." After hanging up, Sarah leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes as she tried to calm her racing thoughts. The connection between Timmy and Daniel felt closer than ever, but it was still just out of reach. She couldn't stop now, not when she was this close. The next morning, Sarah woke up early, her mind already spinning with plans. She decided to visit Elmwood Park herself, to walk the paths and see if anything there sparked a memory or provided a clue. It was a long shot, but she had to try. She couldn't afford to leave any stone unturned. She arrived at the park just as the sun was rising, the early morning light casting a golden glow over the trees and the dewy grass. The park was quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where families would come for picnics or where children would play on a sunny afternoon. But to Sarah, it felt like the scene of a crime, one that had stolen her son away from her. She walked slowly, taking in every detail, her eyes scanning the surroundings with a mixture of hope and dread. The playground was empty, the swings swaying gently in the breeze. The pathways were deserted, lined with benches that had long since been abandoned by the early morning joggers. Everything seemed so ordinary, so mundane, and yet Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something important had happened here. She made her way to the edge of the park, where the trees grew thicker and the path became less clear. It was a more secluded area, one that was easy to overlook. But as she stood there, looking out into the woods, she felt a strange sense of familiarity, as if she had been here before. Perhaps she had, on some long-forgotten family outing with Daniel. Or maybe it was something else, something deeper. She stepped off the path, moving cautiously through the underbrush, her heart pounding in her chest. The trees closed in around her, the sounds of the park fading into the background. It was quiet here, too quiet. and the air felt heavy with the weight of unspoken secrets. And then she saw it. A small, weathered bench, almost hidden by the overgrown foliage. It was old, its paint chipped and peeling, but there was something about it that drew Sarah in. She walked over to it, her breath catching in her throat as she noticed the faintest trace of initials carved into the wood. DC, Daniel Collins. The initials were small, barely visible, but Sarah knew them instantly. Daniel had a habit of carving his initials into things. Trees, school desks, even the kitchen table at home. It was something he did when he was bored, or when he wanted to mark something as his own. Her hands trembled as she traced the letters with her fingers, the rough edges of the carving sending a shiver down her spine. This was it. This was proof that Daniel had been here, that he had sat on this bench, perhaps waiting for someone, perhaps trying to leave a message behind. But what had happened next? And who was the woman he had been seen with? The questions buzzed in Sarah's mind, louder and more insistent with each passing second. She knew she couldn't stay here much longer. The park was starting to come alive with the sounds of morning, the distant chatter of people arriving to enjoy their day. But she couldn't leave without finding out more. As she turned to leave, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Jack's name on the screen. "Jack?" she answered, her voice breathless with anticipation. "I found something," Jack said, his tone urgent. "The woman who was seen with Daniel at the park, there's a match in the system. Her name is Lucy Harrington. She was a foster parent for a while, but she disappeared around the same time Daniel did. No one's seen her since." "Lucy Harrington," Sarah repeated the name, her mind racing. "Do you have any idea where she might be?" "Not yet," Jack admitted, "but I'm following the lead. I'll keep you updated." Sarah thanked him and hung up, her thoughts swirling as she made her way back to the car. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but there were still so many missing parts. Who was Lucy Harrington, and what had she done with Daniel? And why had Timmy ended up with Daniel's bear? As she drove away from the park, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of urgency building inside her. She was getting closer, but with every step forward, the stakes seemed to rise. Time was running out. She could feel it. But no matter what, she wasn't going to stop until she found out the truth. For Daniel, for Timmy, and for herself. The drive back from Elmwood Park felt endless, despite Sarah's foot pressing hard on the accelerator. Her mind was consumed by the new lead, Lucy Harrington. Who was she, and how was she connected to Daniel? The possibility that this woman had something to do with her son's disappearance sent shivers down her spine. When she arrived home, the house felt even more oppressively quiet than usual. Sarah dropped her keys on the table and immediately called Jack, hoping for an update. The phone rang several times before he answered. "Sarah, I've been digging," Jack said, his voice grave. "Lucy Harrington is a ghost. After she disappeared, there was no trace of her. No credit card activity, no new address, nothing. It's like she vanished into thin air." "But she must be somewhere," Sarah insisted, her voice taut with frustration. "People don't just disappear." "I agree," Jack said, "but finding her won't be easy. I've contacted some old friends in law enforcement, but it's going to take time." Time. The word echoed in Sarah's mind like a warning bell. How much time had already been lost? How much longer could she wait, knowing that every passing day might mean more distance between her and the truth? "I'll keep you posted," Jack added. "But in the meantime, try to stay calm." Calm? How could she stay calm when she was on the verge of discovering what had happened to her son? But Sarah knew Jack was right. She needed to keep her emotions in check, to think clearly if she was going to figure this out. After hanging up, Sarah walked to the window and stared out at the empty street. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the lawn. In the growing darkness, her thoughts turned to Timmy. How much did he know? How much could he remember? She needed to talk to him again. But this time, she couldn't afford to be gentle. She had to get answers, even if it meant pushing him a little harder. It was a risk, but she was running out of options. The next morning, Sarah returned to St. Mary's Orphanage with a new resolve. She was greeted by Mrs. Hayes, who seemed pleased to see her again. "Back so soon?" Mrs. Hayes asked, her tone light but curious. "I'd like to spend some more time with Timmy," Sarah said, trying to keep her voice steady. If that's all right. Of course, Mrs. Hayes replied. He's in the playroom. I'll take you to him. As they walked through the halls, Sarah felt a sense of unease settling in her chest. She was about to ask a young boy to relive memories that might be painful or confusing, and the thought weighed heavily on her. But she had to know. When they reached the playroom, Sarah saw Timmy sitting alone by a window, staring out at the world with Mr. Snuggles in his lap. The other children were playing nearby, but he seemed completely detached, lost in his own thoughts. "Timmy," Sarah called softly as she approached him. He looked up, his eyes lighting up with a hint of recognition. "Mrs. Collins," he said, managing a small smile. "Do you mind if I sit with you?" Sarah asked. Timmy shook his head, and Sarah took a seat beside him, her heart pounding. She had to tread carefully, but she couldn't let this opportunity slip away. "Timmy," she began gently, "I've been thinking a lot about what you told me the other day, about the lady who used to sing to you. Do you remember anything else about her?" Timmy's face tightened, and he hugged the bear closer to his chest. "She was nice," he said quietly, "but I don't remember her name." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "Do you remember where you lived with her? What the house looked like?" Timmy hesitated, his brow furrowing in concentration. "It was big," he said slowly, "and there were lots of trees outside. But I don't know. It's all fuzzy." Sarah's heart ached for him. He was so young, too young to fully understand the memories he carried. But she had to press on, had to find a way to bring those memories into focus. "Timmy, what about before you came to the orphanage? Do you remember how you got here?" A shadow passed over Timmy's face, and he looked down, his fingers nervously picking at the bear's worn fur. "I remember being scared," he whispered. "I was in a car, and it was dark. The lady, she was crying." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Crying? Why was she crying, Timmy?" "I don't know," he said, his voice trembling. "She just kept saying, 'I'm sorry, I'm so sorry.' And then she wasn't there anymore." Sarah felt a cold chill run down her spine. This was more than she had hoped for, more than she had dared to imagine. But it also raised new questions. If Lucy Harrington had taken Daniel, why had she abandoned Timmy? What had gone so wrong that she felt the need to apologize? "Do you remember anything else, Timmy? Anything at all?" Sarah asked, her voice soft but urgent. Timmy shook his head, tears welling up in his eyes. "I don't want to talk about it anymore," he mumbled, burying his face in Mr. Snuggles. Sarah placed a comforting hand on his shoulder, her heart breaking for him. "It's okay, Timmy. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to." He nodded, still clinging to the bear as if it were his only anchor in a confusing world. They sat in silence for a few moments, the weight of their conversation hanging heavy in the air. Sarah knew she had pushed him as far as she could for now. She had to let him process, to let him find some sense of safety again. But the pieces were starting to fall into place, and Sarah's mind was already working on the next step. She needed to find Lucy Harrington. She was the key to everything. If Sarah could find her, she might finally get the answers she had been searching for all these long, painful months. But even as she thought about it, doubts crept in. What if Lucy was gone for good? What if the trail went cold again? And what if, in the end, the truth was more devastating than she could bear? Sarah looked at Timmy, his small frame huddled against the window, and felt a surge of protectiveness. She had to be strong, not just for Daniel, but for Timmy too. He had been through so much, and he needed someone to fight for him. She stood up, her resolve hardening. "I'll be back soon, Timmy," she promised, though she wasn't sure if he was listening. As she left the orphanage, Sarah's mind was a whirlwind of emotions. She knew the road ahead was going to be difficult, and the answers she sought might come with a heavy price. But there was no turning back now. She had come too far, and as she drove away, the sun dipping low in the sky, Sarah couldn't help but wonder, what would she do when she finally found the truth? The days that followed felt like a blur to Sarah. Every waking moment was consumed by the search for Lucy Harrington, the woman who held the key to unraveling the mystery surrounding Daniel's disappearance and Timmy's past. The world outside her investigation seemed to fade away, leaving her with only one focus: finding the truth, no matter what it took. Jack worked tirelessly, using every resource at his disposal to track down any trace of Lucy. But as days turned into a week, Sarah's hope began to waver. Lucy Harrington had indeed become a ghost. No addresses, no bank transactions, no social media activity. It was as if she had simply ceased to exist. Sarah's frustration grew with each dead end. She spent long hours in her study, staring at the walls covered with photos, notes, and timelines, trying to piece together the puzzle that had become her life. The weight of it all pressed down on her, threatening to crush the fragile hope she still clung to. But she refused to give up. Not now. Not when she was so close. One morning, just as Sarah was beginning to feel the strain of exhaustion, her phone rang. She grabbed it, seeing Jack's name on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat as she answered. "Jack, tell me you have something," she said, her voice tight with anticipation. "I do," Jack replied, his tone serious. "It's not much, but it's a lead. I found a property registered under Lucy Harrington's name. It's a small cabin in a remote area upstate. It hasn't been used in years, according to the records, but it's worth checking out." Sarah's pulse quickened. "Where is it?" Jack gave her the address, warning her that the cabin was in a secluded area, miles away from any town. "I'll meet you there," he said. "It's better if we go together." "No," Sarah said, determination hardening her voice. "I need to go now. I can't wait any longer." Jack hesitated. "Sarah, it could be dangerous. We don't know what we're walking into." "I don't care," Sarah insisted. "If there's even the slightest chance that Lucy's there, I have to go." There was a pause before Jack finally relented. "All right, I'll be right behind you. But Sarah, be careful." After ending the call, Sarah wasted no time. She grabbed her coat and keys, her movements swift and deliberate. There was no room for doubt, no space for fear. She had waited too long, suffered too much. The truth was out there, and she was going to find it. The drive to the cabin was long and tense, the winding roads growing narrower as she left the city behind. The landscape changed from bustling urban sprawl to dense forests, the trees towering above her as if they were closing in. The farther she drove, the more isolated she felt, but it only fueled her determination. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Sarah spotted the turnoff to the cabin. It was a narrow dirt road, barely visible through the thick undergrowth. She slowed the car, her heart pounding in her chest as she made the turn. The road was rough, the trees pressing in on both sides, their branches casting eerie shadows across the path. When she finally reached the cabin, she was struck by how desolate it looked. The small structure was weathered and worn, its wooden walls bleached by the sun and battered by the elements. There was no sign of life, no sound except for the wind rustling through the trees. Sarah parked the car and stepped out, her eyes scanning the area. The cabin was surrounded by overgrown vegetation, the grass tall and unkempt. It didn't look like anyone had been here in years, but she wasn't about to turn back. Not now. She approached the cabin cautiously, her heart thudding in her chest. The front door was slightly ajar, creaking on its hinges as the wind pushed it back and forth. Sarah paused, listening for any sign of movement inside, but all she heard was the sound of her own breathing. With a deep breath, she pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, filled with the scent of old wood and decay. The interior was small and sparse, with only a few pieces of worn furniture and a thin layer of dust covering everything. It was clear that the cabin had been abandoned for some time. But Sarah wasn't here for the cabin. She was here for the answers it might hold. She began to search the small space, opening drawers, looking behind furniture, her hands shaking slightly as she moved. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of the wind outside made her jump, her nerves on edge. Then, in the back corner of the cabin, she found something that made her freeze. A small, tattered photo album lay on a shelf, partially hidden behind a stack of old books. Sarah's hands trembled as she pulled it out, her breath catching in her throat. The album was old, the edges worn and the cover faded, but it was intact. She opened it slowly, her heart pounding as she turned the pages. The photos inside were faded, the colors muted with age, but they were clear enough. The first few pages showed a young woman, Lucy Harrington, smiling with a man who appeared to be her husband. They looked happy, their lives seemingly untouched by the darkness that Sarah knew had followed. As she flipped through the album, the photos changed. The happy couple was joined by a small child, a boy with bright eyes and a joyful smile. But as Sarah turned the pages, that joy began to fade. The last photos were different, the smiles forced, the light gone from their eyes. And then, there were no more pictures of the man. Only Lucy and the boy, who now looked older, more solemn. Sarah's stomach twisted as she reached the final pages. The last photo was of Lucy, holding a child wrapped in a blanket, standing in front of a different house. A house Sarah recognized all too well. It was her house. And the child in Lucy's arms was Daniel. The world seemed to tilt, and Sarah had to grip the shelf to steady herself. Her vision blurred, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. It was true. All the doubts, all the fears. Lucy Harrington had taken Daniel. But why? And where was he now? Before Sarah could process what she had discovered, she heard the crunch of footsteps outside. Her head snapped up, her body going rigid with fear. Someone was here. She quickly closed the album and shoved it into her bag, her heart racing as she backed away from the door. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Sarah's mind raced, trying to decide whether to confront whoever it was or hide. The door creaked open, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering so loudly she was sure whoever was outside would hear it. Then, a voice called out, low and cautious. "Sarah, are you here?" It was Jack. Relief flooded through her, and Sarah stepped out from her hiding place, her legs shaky. "Jack," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack stepped inside, his eyes scanning the room. When he saw Sarah, he let out a breath he'd been holding. "Thank God. I thought something had happened to you." "I'm fine," Sarah said, though she knew she was far from fine. She pulled the photo album from her bag and handed it to him. "Look at this." Jack took the album and flipped through it, his expression darkening with every page. When he reached the photo of Lucy holding Daniel, he looked up at Sarah, his eyes wide with shock. "She had him," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "She took my son." Jack nodded, his face grim. "But why? What happened to him?" "I don't know," Sarah said, her voice cracking, "but I'm going to find out." Jack's gaze hardened with determination. "We'll find her, Sarah. We'll find out what she did with Daniel. But we need to be careful. Whoever took these photos was watching you, watching your family." Sarah nodded, trying to steady her breathing. The cabin, the photos, Lucy's disappearance, it all pointed to something much darker than she had imagined. But she couldn't let fear stop her. She had come too far, and she owed it to Daniel to see this through. "We need to leave," Jack said, his voice firm. "There's nothing more we can do here. I'll take this to my contacts, see if we can trace Lucy's whereabouts." Sarah agreed, though every fiber of her being wanted to tear the cabin apart to find any clue that might lead her to Daniel. But she knew Jack was right. They needed to regroup, to plan their next move. As they left the cabin, Sarah cast one last glance at the weathered structure, a sinking feeling settling in her chest. The truth was closer now, but it was wrapped in shadows, and the path ahead was more dangerous than ever. But Sarah knew she wouldn't stop. She couldn't. She had to find Daniel, no matter what it took. And as she and Jack drove away, the night closing in around them, Sarah braced herself for whatever lay ahead. The answers she sought were within reach, but they would come with a price, and she was prepared to pay it. The drive back from the cabin was a silent one, the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on both Sarah and Jack. The photograph of Lucy Harrington holding Daniel haunted Sarah's thoughts, replaying in her mind like a cruel loop. It was undeniable proof that Lucy had been in her life, that she had somehow crossed the boundary between Sarah's world and the one she had built in isolation since Daniel's disappearance. But why? And more importantly, where was Daniel now? When they finally reached Sarah's home, Jack parked the car and turned to her, his expression serious. "We're close, Sarah, but we need to be smart about this. Whoever Lucy Harrington is, she's been hiding for a reason. We can't afford any mistakes." Sarah nodded, trying to focus despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. What's the next step? I'll contact my people and get this photo circulated, Jack replied. If Lucy is still out there, someone will recognize her. But we also need to think about security. If she's been watching you, she might know more about your life than we realized. The thought sent a chill down Sarah's spine. The idea that Lucy, or whoever had been behind those photos, might have been close enough to watch her, to know her every move, made her skin crawl. But there was no room for fear now. She had to stay strong. Okay, Sarah said, her voice steady. Let's do it. Jack gave her a reassuring nod before getting out of the car. They walked up the steps to Sarah's front door, and as she unlocked it, a sense of unease settled over her. The house felt different somehow, too quiet, too still. Do you want me to stay for a while? Jack asked, sensing her hesitation. Sarah shook her head. No, I'll be fine. You focus on tracking down Lucy. I'll take care of things here. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Call me if you need anything. I'll keep you updated. With that, Jack left, and Sarah was alone. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her, and leaned against it, letting out a shaky breath. The house felt emptier than ever, the silence almost oppressive. She wandered through the rooms, her footsteps echoing in the stillness, her mind racing. She found herself back in Daniel's room, drawn there by a force she couldn't resist. The room was exactly as she had left it after her last visit. The bed neatly made, the toys arranged just so, as if waiting for a child who would never return. Sarah stood in the doorway, her eyes tracing every detail, her heart aching with a familiar pain. But this time, there was something different. This time, she wasn't just mourning. She was determined to find him, to bring him back, no matter what it took. She sat down on the edge of Daniel's bed, her hands gripping the soft fabric of his blanket. She needed to think, to process everything that had happened. Lucy Harrington had taken her son. But why? What had driven her to commit such a terrible act? And where was Daniel now? As she sat there, her phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She quickly pulled it out, hoping for an update from Jack. But it wasn't him. It was a text message from an unknown number. The message was brief, only a few words, but they sent a jolt of fear through Sarah's entire body. Stop searching, or you'll regret it. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stared at the screen, her hands trembling. Someone was watching her. Someone who knew exactly what she was doing. Her first instinct was to call Jack, but something stopped her. Whoever had sent the message might be watching her right now. If she made a sudden move, if she called for help, it might trigger something far worse. Instead, she quickly deleted the message, her mind racing. She needed to think this through carefully, to stay one step ahead of whoever was trying to scare her into backing down. But she couldn't do this alone. She needed someone she could trust, someone who wasn't as closely tied to the investigation as Jack. And she knew just who to call. Sarah dialed the number, her fingers shaking slightly. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Hello? Anita, it's Sarah, she said, trying to keep her voice calm. I need your help. Anita Patel was one of Sarah's oldest friends, a lawyer with a sharp mind and a fierce loyalty. They had met in law school and had stayed close ever since, despite the ups and downs of their lives. If there was anyone Sarah could count on, it was Anita. Sarah? What's going on? You sound, Anita began, but Sarah cut her off. I can't explain everything over the phone, Sarah said quickly, but I'm in trouble. I need you to come to my house. Now. There was a pause, and then Anita's voice grew serious. I'm on my way. Sarah ended the call and stood up, trying to steady herself. The minutes that passed felt like an eternity as she waited, every sound in the house magnified by her anxiety. But soon enough, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside, and she rushed to the door. Anita stepped out of her car, her dark hair pulled back into a tight ponytail, her expression determined. She was dressed in her usual business attire, a sleek black suit and heels, but there was an intensity in her eyes that told Sarah she was ready for anything. Sarah, what's going on? Anita asked as she approached the door. Sarah quickly ushered her inside, closing the door behind them. I don't have much time to explain. But I need you to know that someone is watching me. I got a message, someone telling me to stop searching for Daniel. Anita's eyes widened, and she immediately went into protective mode. Have you told the police? Does Jack know? No, Sarah said, shaking her head. I can't involve the police yet. And I didn't tell Jack because I'm afraid they're watching him too. I need to figure out who's behind this, and I need your help to do it. Anita frowned, clearly worried, but she nodded. Okay, what do you need me to do? I need you to help me trace the number that sent the text, Sarah said. I know you have the contacts for that. We need to find out who's behind this. Anita nodded, already pulling out her phone. I'll make some calls. But Sarah, you need to be careful. Whoever sent that message isn't messing around. I know, Sarah replied, her voice resolute, but I can't stop now. Not when I'm this close. As Anita made the call, Sarah paced the room, her mind racing with possibilities. Was Lucy Harrington the one behind the message? Or was there someone else involved, someone even more dangerous? The uncertainty gnawed at her, but she refused to let it paralyze her. Anita hung up the phone and turned to Sarah, her expression grim. It's going to take a little time, but I've got people working on it. We'll find out where that message came from. Thank you, Sarah said, relief flooding through her. Anita stepped closer, her voice softening. Sarah, are you sure you're ready for what you might find? I mean, you've already uncovered so much. What if the truth is worse than you imagined? Sarah looked at her friend, the fear and doubt swirling inside her. But she knew the answer. She had known it all along. I have to find out, Anita, she said quietly. No matter what. Anita nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. Then we'll do it together. The two women sat down at the kitchen table, waiting for the next piece of the puzzle to fall into place. The house around them felt like a fortress, holding its breath in anticipation of what was to come. And as the night deepened, Sarah's resolve only grew stronger. She had faced threats before, but this time, it was different. This time, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for Daniel, for Timmy, for the truth. No matter what shadows lay ahead, she was ready to confront them. The hours dragged by as Sarah and Anita waited for any news from the contacts Anita had reached out to. The house felt like it was holding its breath, every creak and whisper of the wind outside only heightening the tension. Sarah sat by the window, her eyes trained on the darkened street, every shadow a potential threat. The message she had received still weighed heavily on her mind, its ominous words echoing in her thoughts. Anita sat across from her, her phone on the table between them, both women silent as they tried to piece together the puzzle that had consumed their lives. Finally, just as the first light of dawn began to seep through the curtains, Anita's phone buzzed. She grabbed it quickly, her heart racing as she read the message. It's from my contact, Anita said, her voice low but urgent. They traced the number. It's a burner phone, no name attached, but they were able to get a location. The signal was last active at a motel just outside of town. A motel? Sarah echoed, a knot forming in her stomach. Do you think it could be Lucy? It's possible, Anita replied, her eyes narrowing as she considered the possibility. Or it could be someone else, someone who's been watching you. Sarah stood up, her nerves humming with adrenaline. We need to go there. Now. Anita hesitated. Sarah, this could be dangerous. We don't know who we're dealing with. I don't care, Sarah shot back, her voice fierce. I need to know who sent that message. I need to know who's behind all of this. And if there's even a chance that it's Lucy, I have to take it. Anita saw the determination in Sarah's eyes and knew there was no point in arguing. She nodded, grabbing her jacket. All right, let's go. The drive to the motel was tense, the early morning light casting long shadows across the road. The world felt strangely quiet, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her thoughts racing ahead of her. The motel was only a few miles away, but it felt like it took hours to get there. When they finally arrived, the motel was exactly what Sarah had imagined. Run-down, barely maintained place with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. It was the kind of place where people went to disappear, to hide from the world. Sarah parked the car a few spaces away from the entrance, her eyes scanning the area for any sign of movement. There were a few cars in the lot, but nothing that stood out. The windows of the rooms were mostly covered by heavy curtains, making it impossible to see inside. "This is it," Anita said quietly. "The signal came from one of these rooms." Sarah nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't afford to be reckless, not now. They had to be careful, to approach this situation with the caution it demanded. But the fear of what they might find, of who they might find, gnawed at her. "Let's go," Sarah whispered, and the two women stepped out of the car, moving quickly but quietly toward the motel. They reached the door of the room where the signal had been traced. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she reached for the doorknob, her hand trembling slightly. She glanced at Anita, who gave her a reassuring nod, before turning the handle and pushing the door open. The room was dimly lit, the curtains drawn tightly shut. The air was stale, thick with the scent of mildew and dust. But what caught Sarah's attention immediately was the figure sitting on the bed, head bowed, as if waiting for them. "Lucy," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. The woman looked up slowly, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. It was Lucy Harrington, older than the last photo Sarah had seen, her face etched with lines of stress and exhaustion, but unmistakably the same woman. "Sarah," Lucy said, her voice hoarse and cracked. "I knew you would come." Sarah felt a surge of emotion, anger, fear, desperation, all battling for dominance as she stared at the woman who had haunted her thoughts for so long. She took a step forward, her voice shaking as she spoke. "Where is my son, Lucy? Where is Daniel?" Lucy's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head slowly. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I never meant for any of this to happen." "Sorry?" Sarah spat, her voice rising with emotion. "You took my child. You took him from me, and you expect me to believe that you're sorry? I didn't have a choice." Lucy cried, her voice breaking as she stood up from the bed. "I had to protect him. I had to keep him safe." "Safe?" Sarah repeated, her mind reeling. "What are you talking about? Safe from what?" Lucy's hands trembled as she wiped at her eyes, her expression filled with a deep, painful regret. "There were people, dangerous people. They were after him. After you. I had to take him, Sarah. I had to keep him away from them." Sarah's world seemed to tilt on its axis. None of this made sense. "What people? What are you talking about?" "People who would do anything to hurt you," Lucy said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was working for them at first, but then I realized what they were planning, what they were going to do to you and Daniel. I couldn't let that happen, so I took him. I took him to keep him safe." Sarah's legs felt weak, and she had to grip the edge of the dresser to keep from collapsing. "Where is he now? Where is Daniel?" Lucy's face crumpled, and she sank back down onto the bed, her hands covering her face. "I lost him," she sobbed. "I tried to protect him, but they found us. They took him from me. I don't know where he is now. I've been looking for him, but I can't find him." "No," Sarah whispered, the word barely audible as the room spun around her. She felt like she was falling, spiraling into a void of despair and confusion. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had fought for, was slipping through her fingers. Anita stepped forward, her voice sharp and commanding. "Lucy, who are these people? Who took Daniel?" Lucy shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know who they are. I only know that they're powerful. They have connections everywhere. I've been hiding from them for years, but I couldn't keep Daniel safe. I failed." Sarah couldn't breathe. She felt like the walls were closing in on her, the air thick and suffocating. "This can't be happening," she whispered, her voice breaking. "This can't be real." "It's real," Lucy said, her voice trembling. "And it's not over. They're still out there, Sarah. They're still watching you. That's why I sent the message, to warn you. You have to stop looking for Daniel. It's the only way to keep him safe." "No," Sarah said, shaking her head as she backed away. "I can't stop. I won't stop until I find him." "Sarah, please," Lucy pleaded, her voice desperate. "If you keep searching, they'll come after you. And if they find out you're close, they'll kill him." Sarah's world shattered. The fear, the anguish, the unbearable weight of what Lucy was saying crushed her. The thought of losing Daniel forever, of never holding him again, was more than she could bear. But the alternative, giving up, abandoning her search, was impossible. She couldn't live with herself if she didn't try to find him, to bring him home. "I won't give up," Sarah said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'll find him, no matter what it takes." Lucy looked at her with a mixture of sorrow and admiration, as if she knew there was no way to change Sarah's mind. "Then be careful," she whispered. "They're closer than you think." Anita stepped forward, her hand gently resting on Sarah's arm, grounding her. "We need to go, Sarah. We need to regroup, figure out our next move." Sarah nodded numbly, her mind reeling from everything she had learned. She turned to leave, but before she could take a step, Lucy called out to her. "Sarah," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Sarah didn't respond. She couldn't. The words caught in her throat as she walked out of the room, Anita close behind her. The door closed behind them with a soft click, and as they stepped outside into the cool morning air, Sarah felt a wave of despair wash over her. But beneath the despair, there was still a flicker of hope. A small, fragile hope that Daniel was out there somewhere, waiting for her to find him. And as long as that hope remained, Sarah knew she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Sarah and Anita drove back in a tense, suffocating silence. The morning light filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows across the road, but Sarah barely noticed. Her mind was a whirlwind of fear, hope, and determination, all colliding in a storm of emotions that left her breathless. Lucy's words echoed in her mind. "They're closer than you think." The idea that these mysterious, dangerous people were watching her, ready to strike at any moment, sent a chill down her spine. But she couldn't let that fear stop her. Daniel was still out there, and she was closer than ever to finding him. "We need a plan," Anita said, breaking the silence as they pulled up to Sarah's house. Her voice was calm, but the worry in her eyes was unmistakable. "We can't just charge in blind." Sarah nodded, trying to focus. "Lucy said they're watching me. That means they're already one step ahead. But if we can find out who they are, we might be able to turn the tables." Anita frowned thoughtfully. "I'll reach out to some people I know, discreetly. We need to gather as much information as we can without tipping them off." Sarah got out of the car, her mind racing with possibilities. As they entered the house, she felt an overwhelming sense of urgency. Time was running out. She could feel it. But she had to be smart, had to stay one step ahead of whoever was pulling the strings. Once inside, Sarah immediately went to her study. She needed to gather every piece of information she had. Every note, every clue, everything that could help them identify these people and find Daniel. Anita followed her, pulling out her laptop and starting to make calls. For hours, they worked in silence, the tension between them thick as they pieced together the fragmented puzzle. Sarah's mind buzzed with the memories of her confrontation with Lucy, trying to sift through the emotions to find any detail, any clue that she might have missed. Then, just as the sun began to sink below the horizon, Sarah's phone rang. She snatched it up, her heart leaping into her throat when she saw Jack's name on the screen. "Jack, do you have anything?" she asked, her voice trembling with anticipation. "I do," Jack said, his tone grim. "It's not good, Sarah. I found out who Lucy was working for, an organization that's been involved in some seriously shady dealings. They operate under the radar, using people like Lucy to do their dirty work. They've got connections everywhere, law enforcement, government, even the media." Sarah felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. "Do you know where they might be holding Daniel?" Jack hesitated, and Sarah's heart sank. "I don't have a location yet," he admitted, "but I found something else. A safe house that Lucy might have used. It's in the city, a place where they stash people when they need to keep them hidden." "That's it," Sarah said, her voice resolute. "That's where they have him." "Sarah, listen to me," Jack said urgently. "These people are dangerous. If you go in there alone—" "I'm not going in alone," Sarah interrupted, her voice firm. "You're coming with me. And Anita too. We can't waste any more time." Jack was silent for a moment, then he sighed. All right, I'll meet you there. Sarah hung up and turned to Anita, who had been listening intently. Jack found a lead. A safe house in the city where they might be holding Daniel. Anita's eyes widened, but she nodded quickly. Let's go. They moved with a sense of purpose, gathering what they needed before heading out the door. As they drove into the city, the tension between them grew. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, each beat a reminder of how close she was, how close Daniel was. The city lights flashed by in a blur as they sped toward the address Jack had given them. The safe house was in a nondescript building, one that blended in with the surrounding structures. It looked ordinary enough from the outside, but Sarah knew better. Inside, the answers she had been searching for were waiting. Jack was already there when they arrived, his car parked discreetly a few blocks away. He stepped out as they pulled up, his expression tense but determined. "Are you ready for this?" Jack asked, his eyes locking onto Sarah's. She nodded, her jaw set with resolve. "I'm ready." Jack led the way, moving with the cautious precision of someone who had been in dangerous situations before. They approached the building quietly, using the shadows to their advantage. Sarah's heart raced as they reached the entrance, a plain, unmarked door that seemed to lead to nowhere. Jack motioned for them to stop, pressing his ear to the door, listening for any sound from within. When he was satisfied, he pulled out a small toolkit and quickly picked the lock. The door clicked open, and they slipped inside. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the streetlights outside. The air was thick with the scent of dust and stale air, the silence almost oppressive. They moved carefully through the narrow hallway, their footsteps barely making a sound. As they reached the end of the hall, they heard a faint noise, muffled voices, coming from a room just ahead. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest, a mixture of fear and hope surging through her veins. Jack held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. He crept forward, pressing his ear to the door, listening intently. After a moment, he turned to Sarah, his expression grim. "There's at least 2 people in there," he whispered, "but I can't tell how many more might be around." Sarah nodded, her mind racing. "We have to get in there. We have to find Daniel." Jack hesitated for a split second, then nodded. "Okay, follow my lead." He pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The sight that met Sarah's eyes made her heart stop. Daniel. He was there, sitting in the corner of the room, his hands bound, his face pale and bruised. 2 men stood near him, their backs turned as they argued in hushed tones. Sarah's breath caught in her throat, a mixture of relief and terror flooding through her. She was so close to him, but the sight of him like that, so vulnerable and hurt, made her blood boil with anger. Jack moved quickly, stepping into the room before the men could react. In a blur of motion, he took them down, his movements swift and precise. The men crumpled to the ground, unconscious before they even knew what hit them. Sarah rushed forward, her heart in her throat as she reached Daniel's side. She knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she gently touched his face. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's me, it's Mom." Daniel blinked, his eyes cloudy with confusion and pain. "Mom?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and weak. Tears streamed down Sarah's face as she fumbled with the ropes binding his hands. "I'm here, sweetheart. I'm here." Anita rushed over, helping Sarah untie Daniel and pull him into a tight embrace. Daniel clung to her, his small body trembling as he buried his face in her shoulder. "I was so scared," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I thought I'd never see you again." "I'm here now," Sarah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You're safe. I promise you're safe." As they held each other, the reality of what they had been through began to sink in. The danger wasn't over. There were still people out there who wanted to hurt them, to take Daniel away again. But in that moment, none of that mattered. They had found him. Sarah had found her son. Jack and Anita stood watch, their eyes scanning the room for any sign of more threats. But the building was silent, the danger seemingly past, for now. "We need to get out of here," Jack said quietly, his voice urgent. "There might be more coming." Sarah nodded, still holding Daniel close. Let's go. They moved quickly, Jack leading the way as they slipped out of the building and back into the night. The air was cool, the city quiet as they made their way back to the car. Daniel clung to Sarah the entire way, his grip on her never loosening. As they drove away, the adrenaline slowly began to fade, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief. They had done it. They had found him. But as they left the city behind, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. There were still questions that needed answers, still shadows lurking in the background, waiting to strike. But for now, she pushed those thoughts aside. They were safe. Daniel was safe. And that was all that mattered. As they reached the safety of Sarah's home, she carried Daniel inside, her heart swelling with love and relief. He was exhausted, his small body worn out from the ordeal, but he was alive. He was with her. As she tucked him into bed, Daniel looked up at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "Mom, are we really safe now?" Sarah smiled, brushing a lock of hair from his forehead. "Yes, sweetheart, we're safe. I promise." He nodded, his eyelids drooping with exhaustion. "I love you, Mom," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I love you too, Daniel," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "More than anything in the world." As Daniel drifted off to sleep, Sarah sat beside him, watching over him as the weight of everything they had been through finally began to lift. The shadows of fear and doubt still lingered, but they were no match for the light of hope that had returned to her life. She knew there would be more challenges ahead, more battles to fight, but she was ready. As long as she had Daniel by her side, she could face anything. And as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, Sarah allowed herself to finally breathe, to finally feel the peace she had been searching for all this time. They were safe. They were together. And that was all that mattered.